Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Islamophobia. I'm your host, Mubashir Tazamol, and today we'll be in conversation with British historian and journalist Taj Ali. Ali's work focuses on class, race, social inequality, and the politics of work in the UK. His writing emphasizes how class and race are deeply interwoven in the UK. For example, many ethnic minority communities are predominantly working class, so the standard narrative that you hear in the media of, quote, white working class misses much of the story. Ali's work is a combination of journalism, activism, and history, as his writing connects current issues such as the housing crisis, labor disputes, racism with longer historical arcs, looking at post-war working class migration, union decline, and political organizing. His contributions and analyses are especially important and timely given the way in which race and class are being discussed in UK politics. And his work stresses the importance of analyzing race, class, and place together rather than in silos. He's the former editor of Tribune magazine and is currently working on a book for Manchester University Press titled Come What May, We're Here to Stay, A Story of South Asian Resistance, which will explore the political activism of South Asian communities in 20th century Britain. Taj, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll jump right in. Your work, like I said, highlights how political and economic elites use race to divide the working class and distract from deeper structural issues. Figures on the right, such as Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick, they frequently frame multiculturalism, especially Muslims in particular, as the source of the UK's problems. How do you see race and class intersecting in Britain today? And why do you think politicians focus so heavily on the quote, white working class narrative rather than addressing the shared struggles of working class people from across different backgrounds?
I think it's worth just reflecting on the history of this kind of sentiment in Britain. It's not necessarily new. If you think back to the way the Jewish community in East London were described, these were Jews who fled pogroms in Eastern Europe and they moved to places like Whitechapel, which now has a very large British Bangladeshi Muslim community. They were also seen as a community that didn't integrate, that were a threat to jobs, that were depicted as a problem. And then when you think about the First World War, after the war in 1919, we had racist riots in British port cities such as Liverpool, Cardiff, South Shields. And again, it was these Black and Asian seafarers who were treated worse than white sailors who were targeted in racist violence. There were perceptions and an anxiety around relationships between Black and Asian people and white women. And you think after the Second World War, in 1958, you had riots in Nottingham and Notting Hill. Again, the West Indian community were targeted. In the 70s and 80s, you had racist violence against minority communities. And the narrative throughout all of this racist violence was that the minority communities don't integrate. They are a threat to the white working class. And the people who pushed these narratives actually didn't give a damn about the white working class either. And when we fast forward to the 2024 racist riots in Britain, which was the worst racist rioting in living memory, what we find is 7 in 10 of the most deprived areas of England saw riots. And many of these places in the northeast of England, Merseyside, they don't have very large minority communities. They are very small, geographically isolated communities. What they do have is deindustrialization, the decline of the mining industry, the decline of tourism in the coastal regions. These are the areas where the far right are doing particularly well. So there's a lot of people who have a grievance, who are very angry around how society has changed. And they pinpoint the decline of industry, the decline of communities built around industry with the increase in migration. And I think it's a narrative that sells particularly well given the amount of insecurity that people have, whether it's housing insecurity, being unable to afford your own home, paying ridiculous amounts of money on rent, whether it's job insecurity, not having that one solid unionized job that you could provide for a family with, that your kids could follow in your footsteps towards. And so I think it's that insecurity that people feel that the far right are really exploiting, because they have a very simple narrative which says they care about those people over there, but they don't care about you. And that could be a migrant, it could be an asylum seeker, it could be a Muslim, it could be a refugee. It's the other. And it always will be the case that they have these stereotypes about minority communities. Um, it's worth pointing out that ethnic minority communities are disproportionately working class. We too suffered the consequences of deindustrialization. My dad was a Vauxhall factory worker. He met people from all different backgrounds on the assembly line, on the picket line. We just lost the Vauxhall Motors factory in Luton. That's 120 years of industrial history. And people are very angry about that, and they're right to be angry. But we're not pointing the finger at people from particular backgrounds. We're pointing the finger at government that failed to invest in those kinds of industries. And so I think as long as you have housing insecurity, economic insecurity, poverty, deindustrialization, and you have a British political and media class that frequently demonize and dehumanize people of color, we are going to continue to see these narratives prevail.
Yeah, it's almost as if there are voices and actors, and especially within the state, that are playing on people's emotions. So, like you said, there's real anxiety, there's real fears about cost of living and just being able to support and provide for your family. And they're able to, well, media and political elites and also social media influencers point to a certain group and say, well, these are the people to blame,
Mm.
rather than actually talking about what are the policy failures of those in charge. You talked about deindustrialization, and you talked about Luton. In September, The Guardian published a short documentary you were in examining the polarization of communities in Luton, which is also the hometown of far-right anti-Muslim personality Tommy Robinson. I found the documentary to be really eye-opening in the sense that what you often hear about Luton from certain voices didn't translate like on the ground in reality. In your experiences being from Luton and in your experience speaking with individuals from the town, what did you discover to be the real issues rather than the narratives that we so often hear?
I think when you live in a truly multicultural community, you don't see things in terms of color. You don't see things in terms of people's nationality or background. You treat an individual as an individual. So in Luton, as a British Pakistani, I know that there are dodgy Pakistani landlords. I know there are exploitative Pakistani bosses. I know that in different parts of the town, we have fantastic people doing their bit to make the town better. And we also have serious problems. And one thing we didn't want to do in this film is to sugarcoat some of Luton's problems. They do exist, but a lot of the problems that exist in a town like Luton are economic problems. It's not about racial division. One thing I was honest about in that film is that we do have some racial segregation, but that isn't driven by hostility. It's driven by convenience. If you want halal meat, you want a local mosque, you're likely to live in an area where you can access that. There's also the history around racist violence in towns like Luton that meant minority communities congregate in certain parts of the town. Now, I have spoken to many of my white working class friends in the town who don't live in the same areas to me. And we've all said between us that we need to do more to bring communities together. We're honest about that there is work to be done. But we've never ever felt that there was racial tension and no-go zones, that white people couldn't come to places like Bury Park, the heart of the Asian community, or nor that I would feel unsafe in a predominantly white area of Luton. It's never been the case. It's such a multicultural community that, in the workplace, in college, in various aspects of our lives, we are going to interact with people from different backgrounds. It's impossible not to, really and truly. And I think the people that believe the myths about Luton don't live in Luton, and that's who they sell it to. So we've now got this trend where we have American YouTubers will come to Luton and say, I'm in the worst town ever. There was one guy recently who came out the station and said, I've got a one-way ticket because I don't know if I'm going to make it back alive. And it's ridiculous. Just look at the crime stats. Luton, yeah, it has its problems, but it's not the most dangerous place in the country. if you go to the heart of the Asian community, you're most likely to see an Asian auntie carrying her groceries. I mean, it's not a place that you're going to see crime because there's so much footfall in that area. You're seeing your community around you. You feel safe because there's people on the streets. It's in areas that are abandoned where you have derelict buildings. That's where you tend to see crime. So they're playing on people's fears. I think the narrative that Tommy Robinson constructs about Luton, there's so many myths and exaggerations in that. There's a lot of things he doesn't tell people, and he's never really done any actual work to bring communities together. It's very easy to talk about problems, to exaggerate problems, but what have you actually done to fix problems? What have you actually done to provide solutions? And I don't think people like him are ever going to stop because it's a lucrative industry, Islamophobia. They're making lots of money. Those YouTubers that come to Luton, they're monetizing their hatred of Muslims. They've got their YouTube subscribers, they've got their Substacks, they've got their Twitter tweets about places like my hometown, and there is no incentive for them to ever stop. We are their content. We're not just a target anymore. They rely upon us. That's the irony in all of this.
Yeah, no, that is brilliantly said, because we often forget that a lot of the narratives that are framed about certain places or certain individuals or certain people are coming from outsiders who now we function in a space where being an online personality is a career. And so you have figures like Tommy Robinson who frames himself as working class. He's not working class. He makes I mean, he's friends with Elon Musk. He has Elon Musk paying for his legal bills. That's not a working class individual.
Mm.
Um, and so he benefits from pushing a certain narrative because it's his brand. We're talking about, you're mentioning YouTubers. So it goes into my next question about online disinformation and stoking of racism by social media figures and politicians, which has resulted in real world harm. Like you mentioned, we've had riots, we've had multiple anti-Muslim riots and protests over the years. This past September, we had the quote, Unite the Kingdom rally. It brought together, I think, an estimated 150,000 people, described as one of the largest, if not the largest, far-right gathering in UK history.
Mm.
And this has also meant greater fear, and understandably so, amongst British Muslims, given that the authorities are so reluctant, or honestly they also benefit in some ways from not taking the problem seriously. A number of your pieces have looked back at the 60s, 70s, and 80s when there was an increase of violence from the far right against minorities in Britain. What similarities do you see from that time period and today, and what do you think are the valuable lessons from the past that are most relevant today?
It's really interesting. There is a BBC documentary from 1969 where they follow a group of skinhead racist Chelsea fans who are boasting openly on camera about Paki bashing, about targeting people of color, Pakistanis. And they say something like, "We're not racist. We get on with the West Indians. They're all right. We just hate the Pakistanis." And even in 1969, there were people trying to cloth their racism in the language of integration, that there are communities living parallel lives and our grievances and anger is justified, that we are the real victims. They're not the victims of racism. We are the victims. We are the left behind. When Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech in 1969, I believe, or 68, he said that the black man, in 15 to 20 years, the black man would have the whip hand over the white man. And he had all of these really, fearful predictions that there was going to be civil war, a bit like what Elon Musk says today, there's going to be civil war tomorrow. It's not happened. I don't think it ever will happen. But just this narrative that these communities will never get on. And at the same time, you had newspaper articles when you had Asians being expelled from East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, and coming to Britain. They were British citizens, by the way. They had the passports. The front page headlines was Asian invasion. These Asians are being put up in 4-star hotels. It's the exact same newspaper headlines today, that these asylum seekers are being put up in these hotels, that they are a threat to women and kids. And we've had this historically, this idea that the relationships between black and Asian people and white women is a serious problem. People were killed over things like that in Britain. I think the one thing we have to do is be honest about the fact that migrants, Muslims, minority communities, we are not exceptional. There's good within us, there's bad within us. We don't need to be put on a pedestal and treated like something we're not. We can acknowledge that a migrant can commit a crime the same way that someone born in Britain can commit a crime. But we're not going to be making any generalizations. The unfortunate reality that we face today is that a crime committed by a migrant or a Muslim is going to be amplified. And it's often when you have a terrorist attack or you have anything like that, we're often waiting for the headline to find out who the aggressor is. And if it's a person of color, people are worried. They think there's going to be riots. Now we've got a ridiculous situation where the police are going to coming out, and there was a driver in Liverpool who'd driven over some of the fans, and the police, Merseyside police, come out and said that he was a white man. Why? Because they feared that if they didn't put out that information, there could be racist riots. That's a really scary position to be in as a country. And when these incidents are done by white British people, all of these alt-right influencers, these people on Twitter, they go silent. And it's almost like they're waiting for the opportunity to justify racist violence. There's still racist violence happening, by the way, on a day-to-day basis, particularly in the northeast of England, Merseyside, where the minority communities are much smaller. This summer, we've seen attacks on mosques. We've seen Sikh women being sexually abused in the Black Country. Horrific stories. A 9-year-old black girl in Bristol shot with an air gun. And to think in 2025, as a historian, I'm reading headlines that remind me of the 60s and 70s is quite frightening. I think what's different today is that they have a lot more tools in their arsenal. They have TV channels now. We've got GB News in Britain, Talk TV. We've got the alt-right influencers. We've got a trillionaire who could be spending his money and resources tackling poverty. Instead, he's amplifying misinformation about Muslims and migrants, and amplifying someone like Tommy Robinson. They're increasingly coordinating internationally as well. Tommy Robinson was recently in Poland. He's been traveling up and down. He's went to Israel recently as well. And even his Unite the Kingdom rally, half the speakers were not from Britain. And so they have adapted, they have evolved, they have tried to justify their racism, and they are playing on people's fears and insecurities. And unfortunately, if you are concerned about mass migration, the asylum system, grooming gangs, these might be the first people you come across when you're doing your research on these topics. And I think those of us who want to fight Islamophobia and racism, we also need to address some of their concerns. That doesn't mean compromising on our values and principles, but it does mean having the discussion. There's no point saying, it's all the billionaires, it's all the elite. You have to tackle people's anger. You have to address people's concerns, and that's how you disarm people and talk about the issues that really impact them in terms of economics. I've had numerous conversations in the last few years with people. Just recently I was in Sarajevo and my flight was delayed, and I was in the airport, and there was some Plymouth football fans. Plymouth is a predominantly white area of England, and one of them had an England tattoo, and he sat down opposite me and he was having a few drinks, and we just started talking about the football. And then one of them said, "What do you think about the burqa?" And it was almost like he was waiting to gauge my reaction. And I wasn't offended. And I told him what I thought. He asked me, "Is it forced on women?" And I said, I don't know many women that it's been forced on. They choose to wear it. If it is forced, that's wrong. It just so happens that my sister, who wears a hijab, was also at the airport. And I called her over, and she had a really nice chat with them. She's a doctor. And they were lovely to her, saying, you should get priority boarding because you're a doctor. And some of the best doctors in Plymouth are the Indian doctors. But they acknowledged that they'd not really spoken to Muslims, and they'd seen a lot of the crap online, and they thought it was awful. And I told them about my mum's experience of racism in the 70s and 80s, and they really got it. And just a few days later, Luton Town Football Club played Plymouth at home, and the local mosque was giving out refreshments to celebrate, I think it was the 120th anniversary of Luton Town Football Club. And they would have benefited from that. And one of the fans actually got in touch and said, I had a lovely chat with some of the Muslim brothers. And I thought that's a really fantastic way to address people's concerns, opening your doors. A lot of the mosques in the UK do open their doors. Now, I'm not naive. I know you can't win everyone over. I know there are people who are unwilling to even have the conversation. But I think there are a lot of people in this country who have concerns, who have questions, who feel uncomfortable asking those questions. And we have to facilitate the spaces for them to have that discussion with us, because ultimately we're not going to win this fight against Islamophobia by just fighting them on the streets. We would lose.
Yeah, no, I think that captures a lot of also what you talked about in the documentary when you were in Luton, of just kind of humanizing everyone and talk like really face-to-face conversations, which I also think that we don't do enough anymore. We live in such a digital age, and especially post-COVID, where everything kind of went virtual online, having that face-to-face interaction has really declined. And
Mm.
once I think I do agree, there are some people that you will never, there's just no room for conversation. But I also believe that the vast majority of people are misinformed, don't know where to get the right information, and have grievances that are then exploited by figures online. And you touched on, Elon Musk. You have international figures now. The Unite the Kingdom rally had European politicians, Western politicians who were all and influencers and figures who are all saying the same anti-Muslim rhetoric, same tropes of, they're coming over, they're going to take over, talking about demographic changes, kind of really like fear-inducing of speeches. And so if people are locked in their homes, they can't pay for anything, they're struggling to eat, and this is all that they're ingesting, it's an emotional response. It's going to be emotionally, it's being fed a certain diet. So unless like more of those face-to-face interactions are so important in breaking down those stereotypes. But and I think the part where you said about just talking about a topic of, football,
Mm.
sharing similarities. We all
Yeah,
have the same, we all have like stuff that we can have shared
yeah,
opinions on, just like everyday kind of things.
yeah,
And that opens the door for more, if they feel comfortable, for more conversations that this person asked you.
yeah.
Um, and I think that goes to say that they felt comfortable enough to ask you that question. Also framing it in a way where it's like, are they forced? What do you think about it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you have to establish that common ground first,
Mhm.
where they know that you're open-minded enough to have the conversation. I think one of the problems we've had recently is we have all retreated into silos.
Mhm.
There's a lot of the purity politics, this narrative that it's not my job to educate you on racism. I don't subscribe to that view as a journalist. Maybe it's not for everyone, but for me, I'd rather be doing that work than preaching to the converted. I'm quite sick and tired of going to these events and talking to people about racism and thinking, you already agree with me on racism. That's why you're in the room.
Mhm.
And so, through that documentary, we're hopefully going to be doing another film where we are going to go to predominantly white working class areas and get the experience of the minority communities there. But I'm keen to talk to everyone, actually, even if it's me in an uncomfortable position, because ultimately, I think that's how we move forward. We cannot allow the far right to speak on behalf of the white working class. And historically, there were many progressive voices within these communities.
I mean, exactly what you said of speaking to all different communities. It brings me to my next question of, I'd really like to get your thoughts on Zohran Mamdani's recent victory in New York City. His campaign centered on issues affecting the working class, particularly the cost of living. But he was also navigating politics, the politics of identity as a South Asian Muslim man. And that's something that his opponents tried to use against him. What lessons, if any, do you think politicians in the UK could take from Mamdani's campaign and messaging? And do you think a similar movement focused on class solidarity could gain traction here?
I think it's very interesting that Zohran Mamdani actively went to Trump voters. to speak to them, to listen to them, to have a conversation with them. There's a lot of talk about how great he is as a communicator, and I think he is a real talent. I think the video content that he does is fantastic, some of the ideas around it, but it's also what he prioritizes. He prioritizes the cost of living. He tries to unite all people in New York around that common agenda of lowering the rent, lowering the bills, making life easier, addressing food inflation. That affects everyone. And I think one of the problems we sometimes have on the British left is that too often we're preaching to the converted, we're obsessed with moral purity politics, we're not actually getting out there and talking to people and being put in an uncomfortable position where it is your job to win people around. You're not writing people off. I think he's done that exceptionally well. No doubt there will be more attacks on the way because he is a successful Muslim in New York. I have no doubt there'll be all sorts of smear campaigns. I think the way he's handled those smear campaigns has been dignified. He's not retreated on his views on Palestine. He's not shied away from talking about Islamophobia and racism. And so it is possible to stand for internationalism, to stand for anti-racism, and to prioritize the needs of ordinary working class people. So I think I have seen attempts on the British left to try and replicate some of what Zohran does, but it's got to be more than just a few videos. It's got to be a change in terms of what you prioritize, who you speak to, and who you speak for.
Yeah, I think with Mamdani's campaign, along with obviously his brilliant sort of messaging and his speeches, you saw him literally speaking to every community in New York City. You saw him, speaking to taxi drivers. You saw him at a club. You saw him going to synagogues. He literally spoke to every community, listened to their concerns, and really he simplified it. I think he didn't make politics complicated. It's politics, and being a politician is representing your community. So he went and listened to his community and provided solutions and policy, his entire policy outline on how he's going to tackle the issues that matter to everyone. So I think that in British politics, like you said, especially amongst the left, sometimes that gets lost.
I mean, to give you an example, I recently met over coffee. I'd not seen him in years. We had a long chat on a bunch of things, and he said, Taj, I don't know the difference between left and right. And I said, well, what is your interpretation of left and right? He said, oh, left I associate with the blue-haired liberals on the Palestine demos who are nice people, but probably not something that I'm involved in. And the right, he said, is people like Tommy Robinson. That was his understanding. And I explained to him that fundamentally it comes down to economics. Here's what the left views in terms of the state and the market. And he asked a bunch of questions. He played devil's advocate and all this. But he really enjoyed the conversation and said he never had the chance to talk politics. And I found in particular when I went to university, which was a lot more middle class, that there was lots of people reading books. There was lots of theories. There was lots of talk about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and all this and that. And that does not resonate in a town like mine. What people want to know is, how do I get food on the table? How do I have a roof over my head? How do I feed my kids? That's what matters to people. And I think Zohran's campaign, speaking on those key issues, is what resonates. If you try and make politics inaccessible, I think you're only bound to lose. And too often, people don't even realize they're doing it. People assume that others will have the same level of understanding, and they won't. They're also sick and tired of the petty factionism, sectarianism that you see on the left all the time. And I think running a clean campaign that focuses on ordinary people, on key economic issues, is the best way forward.
And often I think what we've seen in politics, especially at least I would say definitely in the last decade, it's been more so of targeting your opponents and saying we're not them, rather than this is what we stand for and this is what we're going to do. So it's become more of mudslinging rather than actually talking about the issues that matter. And then you end up losing people because you're not speaking to them.
Yeah.
So you have less people being involved in politics because it's just become so nasty, really. It's just become very, very toxic, and it's not actually addressing any of the issues that are of concern. And the issues are growing. We talk about the NHS, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about jobs. I think I recently saw reporting that unemployment has risen again, I think, under since Labor's been in government. Those are the concerns for the average person, but it's not being tackled.
No, it's not. And, child poverty is another big one. 109 kids are being pushed into poverty every single day, primarily to what we have in Britain, the two-child limit. That if you have more than two kids, you're being denied additional welfare. And it's disproportionately impacted Pakistani and Bangladeshi households who have more kids. And for years, we've been talking about abolishing it would lift so many kids out of poverty. It wouldn't cost a lot of money. And that's not been the priority of politicians. And we live and breathe it in a town like Luton, where nearly half the kids are growing up in poverty. We see the impact. We know kids that are skipping meals, and it's affecting their concentration. And again, as I said, you're talking earlier about the documentary. That's the stuff people talk about. The price of bread, the cost of living, the bills going up, the ridiculous energy prices in this country. And then you hear about the energy companies making lots of profits. And so people can connect the dots. People are not stupid. They know they're being shafted. They feel like they are being mugged off. And unfortunately, at the moment, the only political party that seems to be extremely different from the others is Reform. And Aditya Chakrabarti at The Guardian just put out a piece recently where he talks about Reform's voter coalition. It's a very diverse coalition of voters. Some of them actually have very left-wing views on the economy, and yet they've been told that it's immigration that's the biggest problem. And so I find that fascinating. And I think more than anything, the three words I often hear from people is we're fed up. Doesn't matter what political party they support, what age they are, even the class background at times. People are just thinking the current system does not work for us. Economic growth does not mean anything for us. It doesn't mean our bills go down. It doesn't mean the food prices go down. And so I think for a lot of people, they are looking for something drastic and radical. And when you're constantly being told it's immigration, 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 people just assume that, you know what, I've got nothing to lose. The mainstream political parties are not doing anything for me. I'll roll the dice and vote Reform. What could I lose?
Along with this, you talked about how the government and mainstream political parties aren't addressing the issues. I think one of the other things also recently is that they're also failing to address Islamophobia. And Labour came in, had originally agreed to the APPG on British Muslims, the definition, and they did a U-turn. They established a working group that submitted its report advising on a definition. And so you see these conversations for years now that have been going on. And in its failure to define or even just acknowledge Islamophobia and how rampant and how horrible it is in the country. We've seen record levels with the recent Home Office figures revealing that in 2025, 45% of religious hate crimes were directed towards Muslims. And earlier this year, the director of Telmama, which is an anti-Muslim hate crime monitoring organization, even stated that it's, quote, the most dangerous time to be a Muslim in the UK. What role do you believe politicians and the media have played in creating this environment? You talked about reform. Where do you see politics heading in Britain? Do you think we'll see a change in terms of tactics and strategies? Or do you think that reform, because it does offer kind of a different narrative in some ways, do you think it'll gain more power?
So when it comes to Islamophobia, there's been a big campaign by politicians on the right and many newspapers to try and prevent us defining Islamophobia. And they've depicted it as an attempt to bring in blasphemy by the back door, that this is an attempt to silence criticism of Islam, to silence criticism of the Prophet. And I've frequently said that this is not a theological dispute. You can make whatever criticism you like of religion, and many mosques in this country openly welcome you to have your discussion and your debate. They enjoy that sort of discussion. This is about people being attacked and discriminated against because they are perceived to be Muslim. We know that some of the first victims of Islamophobia after 9/11 in America were the Sikh community. And we know that in Britain, there have been people who've been mistaken for looking Muslim who've been targeted in Islamophobic hate crime. It's particularly Muslim women who wear the headscarf who have been targeted. It's particularly people in the more geographically isolated areas of Britain who faced this violence. And it's very common. It's extremely common to get racist abuse, Islamophobic abuse on public transport, to have attacks on mosques. I mean, in Portsmouth, there was a guy who pulled out a knife. And luckily, some of the worshippers disarmed him and calmed him down. But that's the radicalization, that an individual who could have mental health problems, who could be in a very vulnerable state, picks up on some of these Islamophobic narratives from the politicians and the papers and goes on to commit a horrible crime. That's the fear. A lot of our mosques look like fortresses at the moment. We have security guards patrolling outside. Our mosques should not have to look like fortresses. And it was really sad that people are celebrating the Home Office are increasing funding for security for mosques. That's not how we tackle Islamophobia. That's dealing with the symptoms of a problem, not the root cause. And the root cause is the narratives. So leading up to those racist riots, one of the biggest moral panics was this idea that Islamists are taking over the country. We had these mass demonstrations in support of the Palestinian people in Gaza around November and December 2023. And at the same time, you had our former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, describing these marches as hate marches. You had Lee Anderson, who's now a Reform Party MP, described the Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, as controlled by Islamists. You had the Reform Party leader, Nigel Farage, say that some British Muslims don't share British values. And all of those narratives embolden the violent racists. From the Labour Party, from the Labour government, there's been a reluctance to say the word Islamophobia. They were very slow to condemn racism explicitly, and there's very little hope or trust in the Labour government. Many people would argue that some of the rhetoric from Labour politicians around intimidation and sectarianism in regards to people voting for independent candidates at the 2024 general election played into Islamophobic tropes as well. In terms of the future of British politics, it's unfortunate, but I do believe that Reform are on course to be the largest party at the next general election. This is partly a failure of the Labour Party to offer any vision. There's many British Muslim voters who will never vote for the Labour Party again, given Keir Starmer's abhorrent comments on Gaza, where he justified the collective punishment of Palestinians. People will not forgive him for that. There's lots of voters who are really angry that Labour promised to lower bills, and bills have gone up, that they promised they won't increase income tax, and it's likely they might increase it at the next budget, that living standards haven't really improved. The vote at the previous general election was more of an anti-Tory vote than a vote for Labour, and you just have to look at the voter turnout and the winning vote share to understand that Labour was never extremely popular. Is there an alternative to Reform? The Green Party are doing better with Zach Polanski as leader. They still make very little difference to Reform's vote share. And that's the crucial thing that people need to understand, that Jeremy Corbyn could set up this new party. He could do particularly well. He could win a dozen or so seats. But what does that mean in terms of the electoral map? We could still have a reformed government and some progressive MPs. And that for me is not good enough. If Nigel Farage becomes our prime minister and cuts immigration, I don't think living standards are going to improve. In fact, I think they will get worse. And then they will move on to their next moral panic, which will be explicitly about Muslims and multiculturalism, the same as it's in most of Europe at the moment. The far right are explicitly Islamophobic. I don't think Farage has gone as far as many of his far right counterparts, but I do believe that that's going to be the next stage because they don't have any real solutions. And so the question is, what else is there? There's been talk that Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, could be a future leader. I think he's probably the more popular of the senior Labour politicians, but even he will have a difficult job in fighting reform. They are doing extremely well at the moment. I believe there's a lot of silent reform voters as well who won't say they're voting reform. Even within the ethnic minority communities, I think there is a perception amongst more established minority communities that immigration is too high. This is a sentiment that is increasingly prevalent even in the ethnic minority communities. It's worth mentioning that diverse communities like Luton and Bradford and Birmingham all voted for Brexit, all voted to leave the European Union. So migrant communities, minority communities are not immune from the rhetoric of reform either. So it's quite bleak at the moment. I think for me, the job, the task ahead is to do the community organizing. So what we talked about in that film around, the people's assemblies, engaging with people in the community, and that should underpin a potential electoral project. I don't think you can do the organizing against a party like Reform without building a strong local base, without speaking to your neighbours, without doing the people's assemblies.
Tosh, thank you so much for outlining all of this. I think the conversation really helps us unpack how elites really it's more of a top-down problem that we're having of creating and sowing division and polarization amongst communities, and your solution is to have those more face-to-face conversation, building from the ground up, building these communities, addressing local concerns, and also you helped us unpack how Islamophobia and racism is used to divide class solidarity. It's used to divide working class people that come from all backgrounds. And it's not something new. You're a historian and you talk about how these narratives have been used before. So I urge everyone who's, if you've listened to this, do share this with others who are very interested in what's going on in the UK, because I do think things are quite tense and things are quite scary. And it's unclear where British politics is headed. As someone living here, I do understand cost of living is a big issue. Jobs, employment, schools, infrastructure. These are all issues of concern that I hear everyone around me talking about. And unfortunately, that those concerns are not being addressed by those people in power right now. And the only things we're getting from the people in power is narratives of, well, immigrants are to blame, Muslims are to blame, integration is the issue, so on and so forth. So this has been a very, very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. For our listeners, please do check out Taj's work online, follow him on social media to stay updated on his latest contributions. For more information on Islamophobia, do check out our website at bridge.georgetown.edu. Thank you again, Taj, and thank you everyone for listening, and have a wonderful rest of your day.